Okay, my name is Nancy McCaffrey. I'm at Emma Clark Library in Setauket, and I am interviewing Lester Paldy on November 29th, 2018 for the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. Okay, so how are you today?
Good.
Okay, so we're just going to start with some biographical information. So when were you born?
March 19th, 1934,
Okay, and where was that?
in New York City in Manhattan.
Okay, and who were your parents?
My mother was Seal Paldy, and my father was Zoltan Paldy.
And what did they do for occupation?
My mother was a homemaker, and she worked part-time as a doctor's receptionist occasionally, but mainly as a homemaker. My father drove a truck, mainly had a small trucking business.
Oh, okay. And did you have any siblings?
Had a brother, Charles, a younger brother, 7 years younger than I.
And was he in the military at all?
No, never.
No.
No.
Okay. So before you entered the service, what were you doing?
I was just graduated from high school.
Oh, so you're very young.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
All right. What branch of the military were you in?
Marine Corps.
The Marine Corps.
Mm-hmm.
So were you drafted or?
No, I enlisted
Oh, okay. And what date was that? Do you remember?
July 1st, 1952.
Everybody remembers that. Okay. And why did you choose the Marine Corps?
Well, I liked the reputation. I thought it sounded challenging, and in general, I liked what I heard about them.
Okay. So when you departed for training camp, what was that like, your early, how did you get, first of all, where was your training camp?
First training was at Parris Island, South Carolina,
Mm-hmm.
and we boarded a train in New York City in Manhattan, and then stopped at various points on the way south, picking up new enlistees as we went south.
Okay.
That was on July 1st. And the most interesting thing I remember about that trip was we had a 3-hour, 4-hour layover in Washington, D.C. And we went at the Union Station and started looking around for a place to eat. And we found a White Castle hamburger place. And we went in and were told, because we had a black enlistee with us, they wouldn't serve him. So we walked out, because Washington, D.C. was a segregated town. And blacks were discriminated against. Even if you were in the military, it didn't matter. They wouldn't serve you. So White Castle was aptly named, and I've made it a point never to eat in White Castle ever again. If it still exists, I wouldn't go there.
No, it's okay. So you went down to
Parris Island.
Parris Island. And
And of course, the other impression you get when you get to Yemassee, South Carolina, which is the train station near Parris Island, was we saw for the first time colored and white drinking fountains.
wow.
So it was rigidly segregated. And from there we were bused to the Marine Recruit Training Depot at Parris Island.
Now, was that segregated as well?
Not on the base, no. There were no black officers and very few, I don't recall any black non-commissioned officers, but there was no obvious segregation on the base.
Okay.
Now, of course, as recruits in training, you don't go to clubs or you don't see any of the other facilities, so I have no idea of what the other facilities were like other than ours. But ours was integrated. We had a few blacks in our platoon,
Okay.
some Hispanics.
And what were your early days of training like?
Well, the training then was brutally severe. In retrospect, it was criminal in the sense that there weren't enough officers to supervise the drill instructors who were sergeants. So the sergeants were allowed to do things that violated the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
Really?
Clearly, and the base commander apparently didn't care enough about it to look into it in detail. The rationale was the training should be severe, I'm sure, because it would be better to be washed out in boot camp than fail in Korea in some way, because the Korean War was raging at the time. So that was my main impression, that the training parts of the training was fine, but that aspect of it, the criminal aspect, always bothered me. And later, when I became a commissioned officer, I had a better chance to understand what went on there. In 1956, they drowned 6 young men. A drunken drill instructor ran them into a salt creek and drowned them. And my battalion executive officer went down and served on the hearing board that looked into that event. And he came back and he told us that what he said it was basically a criminal operation, that the officers and the commanders at Parris Island did not adequately take care of their enlisted men.
Wow. So it was pretty tough.
Well, it was always interesting to me. And of course, there were no longer, since 1956, there was nothing like the Ribbon Creek drownings, but there were fairly frequent incidents of maltreatment and misbehavior on the part of drill instructors. And the Marine Corps never did really much about it. Now it's probably better because of publicity, but the problem was there weren't enough officers at Parris Island in 1952, and those who were there chose not to get involved in the drill instructor routine. They said, let the sergeants do it. And when, on those rare occasions when an officer came around and asked us whether we'd been maltreated, with the drill instructor standing off on the side, we all said, no, just fine, everything is just fine here.
Do any of the instructors stand out in your mind for any reason? And any of your instructors?
Yes, so one was a staff sergeant who I think in retrospect you would describe as suffering from PTSD from his experience in Korea. He was sadistic, and later I learned that after we had left he had actually sodomized another recruit. And I don't know how he was punished for that, whether he was court-martialed, but he was a sick man in retrospect.
Did you have any decent instructors?
One, yes. Tech Sergeant Whistler was a decent man, and I think he tried to treat people fairly and to the extent that he could do anything about it.
Okay. So when you were in training camp, how did you acclimate to it?
Well, if you were smart and athletic, you could get by pretty easily. So I didn't have any trouble getting by. It was physically difficult, but if you understood what was going on around you, you could generally conduct yourself in such a way to avoid real harsh treatment, real punishment, kicks or punches or slaps.
What kind of drills did they have you do?
Well, it was basically a lot of marching drills. They were still fighting the ancient wars, and the military still does that. The rationale for the close order drill and the parading is that it's supposed to instill immediate obedience to commands and a sense of camaraderie. And this was all understood pretty well back in the 1700s when a French officer named Martinet, from which the term comes, realized that people, the Marine, that infantry in particular, liked drilling. They liked the feeling of camaraderie and the rhythms. It was more like a dance in some way. So he manipulated that and made that a part of French army procedure, and was rapidly picked up by other European armies and spread to the United States. So he spent a lot of time marching in unison.
So do you feel the outcome did build that camaraderie? Or?
To some extent, yeah. The Marine Corps is a very close-knit organization, so to some extent it does that. Whether you could do that in a more productive way by doing other things never been obvious to me.
Okay. So how
it's like the generals fighting the last war and the admirals fighting the last war by using systems that don't respond to current situations. Right.
So how were the living conditions as far as
Spartan?
The barracks?
Spartan. We lived in a Quonset hut with no air conditioning. It was extremely hot. It was in July and August of 1952. It was routinely in the 90s. So it was hot, and you sweltered and you sweated. And but again, if you were athletic, you could get by.
And I guess you were.
Enough, apparently.
Yeah. And as far as the food?
Food was adequate. Again, it was all routinely slopped onto your tray. You had to, you didn't have much in the way of choice. You marched into the mess hall as a platoon, and you ate together and you left together. So there was nothing like, I'm sure it's much better today. Now, when you go to a place like Quantico, there are salad bars and there are a selection of things because it's an all-volunteer force now. Right. So they're trying to attract people, young men and women. When we went through, and there were no women at Parris, no women in that I could see at Parris Island. I must have trained somewhere, but we had no contact with female Marines when at Parris Island.
Did they allow female Marines?
Yes, I think so. I think so. They were probably trained separately, as they still are trained separately. They're not commingled with male platoons at Parris Island now.
Okay.
Yeah. As officers, it's a little different. I think you can have well, you go to officer candidate school. I went to officer candidate. I was selected to go to officer candidate school in 1954 after I'd been an enlisted man for 2 years. And then you go to roughly a 10-week program at Quantico in Virginia, which is physically demanding, but there's no maltreatment of any sort. And I always tried to understand why the difference between Parris Island and Quantico, and I concluded that the socioeconomic backgrounds of the enlistees were from the inner city, from the Mississippi Delta, with maybe had high school educations, and could be treated pretty much as the drill instructors wished. No one would complain. Whereas at Quantico, almost everyone was a college graduate. These were people from middle class and upper middle class families, and they were treated, it was physically difficult, but there was no abuse. No one swore at you. There was no misogynistic comments, which were standard at Parris Island in 1952. I wrote an editorial about that, and I submitted it to a Marine journal, and trying to explaining what I thought were the differences. And it was sent back to me by the editor. He said, "We don't need this left-wing stuff." That was the position of the editor of the Marine Corps Gazette, and by then it must have been 1958 or so. I was out and just started I was a college freshman in 1958.
So when you were still in training, did you have any recreational time?
Not at Parris Island.
No, not at all.
No, not at all. No weekends off or anything like that. It was 7 days, 24/7.
Okay, so once you finished your basic training, what were you specializing in? What did you decide?
Well, I went into an aviation unit for a while, so they sent me to a couple of naval schools where you learned about aircraft, jet engines and things. And I did that and then I served with an aviation unit for about 2 years. And then I was selected to officer candidate school, and I went to Quantico, and then from there I did some more aviation work, but then wound up as an infantry officer, and that started in 1956 or so, 57 I guess. So my last 2 years of service were as an infantry officer and intelligence officer with the Marine Infantry Battalion.
Okay. So how long did it take you to go through officers training?
Officer candidate school was about 10 weeks, roughly.
Okay, 10 weeks. All right. And
then you, after the initial school, which is designed more or less like enlisted boot camp to screen people to get those who can't make it out. And once you get through officer candidate school, then you go to a school called basic school, which is about 5 months at Quantico, where you're introduced to the various specialties in the Marine Corps. And you're a second lieutenant by that time, and you're in with a group of other second lieutenants. And it's physically hard and reasonably demanding mentally, but not terribly. And anyone who gets through the officer candidate program in the first place can probably get through basic school as well, because the selection takes place.
So usually you have to have a college degree, but you did not,
yeah.
correct?
No, I only had a high school diploma.
So how did they end up picking you for candidate?
I saw a notice on a bulletin board saying you could take an exam. So it was sort of like an SAT exam. In retrospect, it probably even more simple than the SAT. And so I said, I thought it might be fun to take the exam just to see what happened. And so I took it. And I barely passed, and I got a note some months later to go to Quantico, admitted to officer candidate school. And in my program there, I would say out of 100 people, there were 3 former enlisted men, 3 or 4 former enlisted men, maybe 5 or so, who were also who didn't have college degrees. But everybody else had a college degree.
So if you hadn't gotten into officer school,
I would have left the service. My initial plan was to enlist, because my family had no money, and I was admitted to a couple of colleges, but I had no idea how you supported yourself or how anyone would pay for it. I didn't know people who had gone to college. I didn't know about work study or financial aid or anything like that. So I thought I would serve, initially the plan was to serve 3 years in the Marine Corps and then use the GI Bill to go to college.
Right.
So I would have left, had I stayed on schedule, in July of 1955 and started college then. But because I went to officer candidate school, I had to stay on for another 3 years, so I stayed until 1958.
Okay.
And then went to college.
So you actually...
Been there ever since.
So you actually volunteered for more time in that?
Well,
Yeah.
to volunteer in the sense that if you wanted to be an officer, you had to commit to an additional 3
Yeah,
years.
so that's what you wanted to do?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you got into officers training school and you started
The basic school.
the basic school, and then you
Yeah.
went
From there I was sent to Korea. The war had ended by then, and I was assigned to an aviation unit, and came back, spent 10 months or so in Korea, and then came back, finished my tour with the infantry battalion in May of 1958, and then left to go to college, starting college in September of 1958.
Okay. So when you were in your officers training, what specialty were you doing then? Was it just broad?
Well, at first, my first assignment was as an engineering officer supporting an aviation unit in Korea. And I did that while I was there. And then I did some flight training for a while. I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to go to college, so I didn't stay in the flight training program. And I always wanted to go to college. So I said, this is leading me nowhere. I had no social life. I was always stationed in parts of the world that I thought were pretty primitive and desolate. And I said, this is not the life I want. So I finished my tour in the infantry, as an infantry and intelligence officer in the Mediterranean, primarily, aboard ships and doing practice landings in the Mediterranean and in Turkey. And then left in May of 1958.
Okay,
They asked me if I'd like to stay on and make a career, and I said I really didn't think I did. Without a college degree, I wouldn't have competed well.
Right.
I was getting to be a first lieutenant. I was a first lieutenant. I knew I'd be a captain, but going from captain to major in the Marine Corps is very competitive, especially when the wars have ended. So I'd be competing with people with college degrees, and I wasn't heroic. I didn't have a whole bunch of medals. So I said, this is probably the time for me to break the break. 6 years is enough.
Yeah. So when you were in the intelligence service or area, what did you do there?
My job was to advise the battalion commander on enemy forces, situations, on terrain and weather, and help them plan operations. That's the role of a Marine Corps intelligence officer. So you do reconnaissance operations, you check out beaches, you get in a little rubber boat, and you paddle in at night, and you reconnoiter the beaches, you make measurements.
Okay.
In those days there weren't satellites that you could rely on, so it all had to be done by hand. We worked with Navy underwater demolition team people, the divers, and my job was to go out on the rubber boat and to make depth measurements along the beaches so we would know whether we could get the landing craft in and so forth, and then to write all this up for the colonel and for the report, and help prepare the battalion for the landing that they would make in that area.
So this was still during the war then?
No, the war had ended.
Oh, the war had ended.
These are practice landings
in
the Mediterranean,
okay.
in Greece and Turkey,
Okay.
and Crete, other islands.
Okay. So what was the hardest part for you to adapt to the military lifestyle, if anything?
I didn't find any of it too hard in the sense that I could do it pretty easily. I had to work at it, but it was well within my grasp. In retrospect, you look back in hindsight and you can see things that could have been done differently, really.
Like
For example, if you're a civilian manager or university manager, for example, you consult with people, you ask for ideas, you try to develop a consensus and the like. There wasn't much of that in the military, in my time at least. There were orders to be carried out, it was a chain of command. So if you're down in the chain of command, you're told do this, just no discussion, at least in the units that I served in, which were elite units, about what are the options we have, gentlemen, what should we do, what do you think? Then tell me what you think, and then I'll decide. The commander could have said, but they didn't operate that way.
Okay.
No one ever asked for advice.
Did you make a lot of friendships when you were there?
Yeah, I had some very close friends, yes. One of whom stayed on after I left and was killed in Vietnam in 1966. He was one of the first Marines when they sent the Marines into Vietnam. He was killed in Quang Ngai province.
Did you keep up with anybody after?
A little bit. There are some of the men I commanded in my intelligence unit who kept in touch with me, and we organized a small reunion. By now it must be 15 years ago in Washington, where we met. And every now and then I'll get an email from one of them.
Okay.
But not, otherwise not. And there was another, one of the kids I enlisted with actually, lived in Newark, a black, still lives in Newark, and we talk once a year or so.
Okay. Now, do you recall any kind of humorous or unusual events that happened while you were in the military?
Well, I had nothing nothing that really stands out. Well, we had, most of my commanders were really fine men, but we had one who was definitely not a particularly outstanding officer. We were training on the island of Vieques off the coast of Puerto Rico. In those days, it was still a Navy and Marine firing area, so you could shoot up the island and drop bombs on it, and there were no people to complain. And the training, it was hot, and we were camped at one end of the island, and we often had to hike out at, perhaps, in retrospect, 10 miles perhaps, to the other end and stay out there. And it was a good commander will always stay with his troops, of course. This particular captain said, well, you take the men out there, he would say to us junior officers, and I'll join you in the evening and I'll bring the mail out. So he would take a jeep out later. And he had this very amusing habit. We ate in a tent on Vieques, a pretty good sized tent that would seat probably 20 or 30 people with mess tables. The captains and the majors would sit down at that end, and we lieutenants would sit at the other end. Our company commander, the one I'm talking about now, would sit with the captains and majors. And even though he didn't talk to us at all during the day, hardly, at lunch, to illustrate that he was in command of the situation, he would shout orders to us at the other end of the tent. Oh, Lieutenant Paldy, be sure to do this. Lieutenant Jones, be sure to do that, to show that he was in command to the majors and all. Well, in the Marine Corps, if you get passed over for a promotion from captain to major twice, you're then dismissed from the service.
Oh, really?
So we had the pleasure of one day out in the Mediterranean, he had received his second passover, and we had the pleasure of watching him go down a gangplank to get in a small ship, small boat, to take him back to shore, to send him back to the United States, and
Goodbye.
kicked out of the Marine Corps. So we felt there was some justice.
Okay.
But he was one of the few bad ones that I met. Most of the other officers were really fine people. There were some non-commissioned officers who left a lot to be desired, but
Okay.
one story I remember along those lines is, again, it was on the island of Vieques, and I was new. I was assigned to a platoon as a platoon leader. And I found out that the platoon was out in the field someplace, so I went out to find them. And I found them duck walking with, you know what a duck walk is? You squat, and you sort of, in a squat position, resting on your haunches, you walk along, and you have your rifle and your pack on your back. So he was a master sergeant and most senior enlisted rank, duck walking his platoon in the heat out there. And I said, you know, what's all this going on? And he said, well, they're being punished for something. So I said, well, they're not going to be punished by duck walking anymore. You know, if you've got to correct something, you'll correct them. But so he was not happy to have a junior lieutenant telling him what to do. He was a veteran of the Pacific War. He had a Navy Cross, which is the second highest decoration. So he was not amused when a boot lieutenant was telling him how to run his command, and we never really got along well. On that same island once, I guess I went looking for him again one evening, and I found him and several other sergeants drinking gin in a little tent, and they weren't supposed to be drinking gin in the field, so I said, no more alcohol in the field. So he didn't like that either, I could tell.
Didn't endear you to him.
Yeah. So anyway, that was my terrific introduction to leadership, and I'm trying to understand how one led, took care of one's men, tried to behave decently and serve as a role model for how they should behave.
Okay.
So that was priceless. That was the most important thing I got out of my 6 years of service.
Okay. So when did you actually come home from there?
May of 1958. I had a job selling tickets at LaGuardia Airport for American Airlines for 3 months, and then started school at what is now Stony Brook in September of 1958.
You went to Stony Brook. Okay.
Yes, and been here ever since with leaves of absence to do other things.
And you used the GI Bill at that point?
I used the GI Bill, yes.
Okay.
The GI Bill, and I worked as a lab assistant in the physics department. And my wife, who I married in our sophomore year, had a Saturday job as a dental assistant. So between the GI Bill and those two part-time jobs, we could survive. And we did.
And what did you get your degree in?
Physics and at Stony Brook, and then graduated. I did some research at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, and then did some more graduate work at Maryland. Decided I didn't want to be a research physicist, so I taught high school physics for 4 years at Cold Spring Harbor, and then was offered a position as an instructor at Stony Brook in 1967. So I moved out to Stony Brook in summer of 1967, and been at Stony Brook ever since.
Oh, so you're a professor.
Yeah, now I'm yes.
Okay, so when the GI Bill, did that just cover your bachelor's?
Just a bachelor's degree,
okay.
yes.
All right.
Yeah.
So when you came home, were you able to acclimate pretty good?
Pretty
Or was
well,
it tough?
I guess. My mother said, how did she put it? You used to be such a sweet child, and you're not like that anymore. But it was a bit of a culture shock. I saw the what you would regard after the Marine Corps and its intense discipline and rigid ways of doing things. I saw this sloppy, slovenly civilian environment, and so I found that sort of amusing. I understood what was going on, but it was interesting to me. And because I'd spent a fair amount of time in Asia, so I loved Asian culture, and then it took me a while to adjust, editorcity here. Ways. I love that part of Asia. So coming back to this sort of thing, it took a while to adjust.
Okay, you're talking about South Korea?
South Korea, yeah. And Japan. I'd spent some time in Japan as well.
Was that on leave, or?
They give you, when they moved our whole unit from South Korea, the war had ended now, so the Marine unit that I was serving with was moved intact from South Korea to Japan.
Oh.
So I spent the last part of my tour in Asia in Japan, then came back. Yeah.
Oh, well, that must have been interesting to be there. Okay. Did the service change you in any way?
Probably, yeah, probably. I guess the biggest change was up until the age of, until I became an officer, I think the general behavior was try to avoid responsibility, right? That was in the Marine Corps when people came around looking for people to do things, you hoped you wouldn't be selected because you knew what they wanted you to do would be unpleasant. And then as I got involved in officer candidate programs and later in the officer training programs, I realized that the way to get ahead in the world was to seek responsibility and to assume responsibility and to lead rather than just follow. So that was an enormously valuable lesson for me. That, in fact, if I attribute that to whatever modest success I've had in life. That sense of obligation, right? Noblesse oblige, to those who much is given, much is expected.
Right.
That was enormously important for me.
Okay. Did it affect how you related to others? What you look?
Probably. I mean, others can tell you more how I'm perceived. I think it's hard for me to say that, but I think I'm perceived as very highly disciplined and pretty much no nonsense, straight. I've always aspired to be like the people who were my commanders, in the sense they were, and some of my teachers, some of my undergraduate teachers as well, who are very fine people. So those were terrific role models for me to have.
Right.
Between the leaders, the military leaders on one side and the academic intellectuals on the other, and I could see the virtues of trying to combine all of that, which I've tried to do. But others can decide whether I've been successful
or not. Well, I guess, when you were in boot camp and you met all these different people from different walks of life, did that change your attitude towards people?
Not necessarily. I was always pretty open. I mean, I had lived in an integrated world, pretty much. We lived, during World War II, we lived in we lived in the Queensbridge housing project, which is the largest public housing project in the United States. Mm. And it was mostly white, but there were a few blacks. And I'd always had a couple of black friends, and I don't think we had any Hispanics at the time. And once for a while, I was the only white player on a black basketball team, in a local community league. So the big shock was going south and seeing the way that worked,
right.
And to realize that there was an enormous amount of inequity here, and unfairness, and that the United States was failing badly in its efforts to do things like that. Now, of course, the Queensbridge project on the East River, if you go over the Queensboro Bridge, if you look down to the right as you're going to Manhattan, you'll see the project there. It's the largest one in the United States. Now it's all black and Hispanic.
Oh, okay.
But interestingly, when we were there, it was mostly white, and that's because blacks were pretty much excluded from the public housing project, just as blacks were excluded from VA loans and FHA loans later, because the lenders felt that if you let blacks come in, somehow the housing values will go down and our loans will be worth less if we had to recover the loans in some way. So that was all incorporated in federal policy. It's a line item that there were restrictive covenants. Levittown, for example, here on Long Island, had a rule: you could not sell a house in Levittown.
I didn't know that. Oh.
So it was all, there's something, people don't understand when you look at, well, why are all the blacks living in the ghettos and places? Well, they must like it. It's not so. They were not permitted to come out. And that's why the disparities in net worth, black and white, are as large as they are, because whites, for the most part, bought houses and could. Housing values appreciated, and that added enormously to white net worth, whereas blacks didn't have that opportunity.
Right. Wow. Did your service impact your feelings about the war or military service in general?
Well, later I learned, as a kid, when we went to Korea, we weren't told anything. I had no idea about the culture, the history, the politics, didn't know anything about that. Only later did I realize that it was much later that I realized it was a civil war between, our dictator was a little bit better than their dictator, but not much. So it's not clear to me that the Korean War was completely justified. North Koreans invaded the South, but was it really justified for us to go in? We lost something like 38,000 killed in Korea. It was a big, traditional, conventional war with large military movements. And in retrospect, was it worth it? I'm not so sure.
Okay.
There are arguments for why we needed to contain the communists at that time, and you didn't want to let them have all of Korea pointing at Japan. And so I understand the geopolitical stuff, but in retrospect.
Okay. Do you, are you in any veterans organizations at all?
No, I'm not a member of any formal veterans organization.
Okay.
The Marine Corps invites me back periodically to visit Quantico and things, but, which I've done several times.
And what's the
But,
difference do you see?
I'm sorry?
Do you see any differences now that you go back?
Well, the training is much more scientific. It's better organized, and of course, there's there's no misbehavior on the part of any of the instructors. It's all, and the training is probably more rigorous now than it was when I went through. I mean, I thought it was fairly easy to get through officer candidate school. Now I think it's much harder. So that's all to the good, I think.
Okay, so that would be sort of like a reunion? Do you meet any of the people?
No, not reunion. The Marines come and exhibit periodically at Stony Brook. They're trying to recruit officers. Right? So they're interested in talking to our graduates. And some years ago, I introduced myself to one of the officers who was coming out here from the Garden City headquarters and said, yeah, I haven't been to Quantico at all, I'd like to go back. And he said, well, we'll arrange that. So the first visit probably took place about 20 or 25 years ago, and then I've gone back several times since to observe the training, and most recently in June of this year, where they let me run the leadership reaction course. It's an obstacle course, just to see if I could do it.
Oh, I read about that in the paper.
Yeah, that's me. That was me. I almost did it.
Well,
I only spent a day in the emergency room. Fortunately, there was nothing broken, just bruised.
do you have any messages you'd like to leave for the future generations who listen to your interview?
Well, people should look for opportunities to serve their country in any of a number of forms. Military is just one. Peace Corps, Civilian Conservation Corps, or any of those activities. Teacher Corps. I think it's important. I would like to see some form of military service, or service, not necessarily military, mandatory for all.
You're not the first one I heard say
everyone. And our politicians, for the most part, don't want to tackle that. They're afraid to raise that issue.
Okay.
But I think it would be desirable. In Israel, for example, everybody has to serve in the military for a couple of years.
Okay.
But between all the options, there are plenty of things that one could do to serve one's country.
Right.
So.
Okay. Now, is there anything we haven't covered that you wanted to add?
Well, in general, I look back on the 6 years as something worth doing. I appreciated the opportunities I had to travel, to serve under fine commanders, and to learn elements of leadership that I probably wouldn't have learned in any other endeavor. So no regrets. I probably would have been a better physicist had I gone right from Stuyvesant High School right into college and then right into graduate school. But on the other hand, I perhaps wouldn't have learned about these other things that have contributed, I think, a great deal to my life.
So you just went in right after high school?
Oh, sorry.
You went in right after high school?
A couple of months, yes. In those days, you could graduate in January. So I graduated in January of 1952 from Stuyvesant in Manhattan. And then I guess I did odd jobs and things for a while. And then I enlisted in July 1. And I left July 1, went away for 6 years.
Wow. That's okay. Do you have anything you'd like people to know about veterans that you you may not know?
What can I say? About veterans as such? I don't think I think most veterans live fairly normal lives. I think lots of people think that some veterans who serve in combat zones come back and they're suffering from PTSD and the like. It's probably not true in general. Some are, but most are not. And I think the government has tried to compensate veterans for their service, with the GI Bill, if you're disabled as a result of military service, you can get a disability payment. You can go to the VA hospital. Any veteran can go to the VA hospital in Northport. And so there are things like that are valuable for veterans. And so I don't think the country owes us anything special. I think it's a privilege to serve in many ways. But those programs like the VA hospital and health services are surely very important for some people.
Right. So it sounds overall you had a good experience.
Yes, overall I say I had a terrific experience on Melt. There are things
Right.
that could have been different, could have been better,
Mm-hmm.
but that's true of any endeavor over a long period of time.
And you had a great
I
career.
mean, I see things at the university that I think could be a lot better than they are, for example. So it's true of any organization.
Right. And you've had a very long career at Stony Brook, so.
This is year 51. I retired, technically retired a few years ago, but I still teach one course each semester.
That's great.
So that's fun. It
That's
keeps me
great.
out of my wife's hair, and I like working with young people.
And are you teaching physics or?
No, I teach in the Honors College, so I teach a course called the course I teach most often is a course called Global Issues. I also teach a course on intelligence organizations in the United States. I've spent a leave of absence for a few years with the Central Intelligence Agency.
Oh, okay.
And so that got me interested. And I was an intelligence officer in the Marine Corps, and now I see how it's done centrally in Washington. And so I put together a course that examines issues associated with the intelligence community in the United States, which has its problems as well as its strengths.
Right. That sounds great.
So that's fun to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That was
All
a
right.
great interview. I'm glad you came in.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
And thank
Sure.
you very much.
You're welcome.